Hello, good afternoon. Yeah, thank you for that introduction. So what my brief was to talk about what makes McLaren a high-performance organization and to try and translate that to the application to small to medium enterprises. And I'm quite well placed to talk like that because I actually run an elite small outfit within McLaren Group. I work with racing, but I also run a company who has a mission to deliver breakthroughs in performance for our customers. I'll also talk about a use of data, and I heard from the previous session much talk about data and how we try to convert that to intelligence. Well, that's probably one of the main cornerstones of our competitive advantage in racing. It also underpins the philosophy of how we deliver performance, independent of which field we work in. And then finally, talk about new technologies and how they could shape the way we work as a business. And I thought I'd pick on just two areas. One, how we could approach strategy in a more dynamic way rather than using lag indicators as most companies work today. And also talk about how we change the approach to design of products. Before I do that, could I have a hands up? Who actually works on design of tangible goods? Who works in manufacturing or tangible goods? There we go, look at that. 20 years ago, that would have been half the room. So I will talk about tangible goods, and it's worth saying I've spent half of my life in traditional engineering and also the digital world. I started in digital with phone.com, that started the whole revolution of mobile internet back in the late 90s, so I'm a believer, but I've come back to engineering and I see the convergence of the two, and hopefully that'll come out from the presentation. That's Formula One. It's really where sport and technology come together for the business of entertainment. It's also the sport where every one of us has to feel like a racer. We've got to be driven to win. But winning has different meanings depending on the business that we run. So in my business, for example, or the autocar business, we're driven by producing the very best for everything we do. We wouldn't start a business unless we could be the best, or the first, or we could take a customer to a level of performance that's not yet been realized. So that culture permeates throughout. It's also, like your world, a fiercely competitive world. It's a world where your performance is scrutinized publicly every fortnight throughout most of the year. Millions can be made and millions need to be invested to get that winning edge. And so you can attract the sponsorship funding and the prize money. Similarly, millions are invested to associate with the world's most marketable sport. I mean, that audience is only surpassed by the World Cup or the Olympics, which only happen once every 4 years, not once a fortnight. So people at the back of the grid, they pay for the association. But it's worth looking at those in the middle. There are people who have spent billions of dollars and withdrawn from the sport altogether with nothing to show for it, Toyota being the most prominent example. That's a company that most people emulate for lean manufacturing. Absolutely phenomenal outfit for building cars, but they didn't have the culture to compete in this environment. So the culture has to permeate across the team. And that starts with talent. We start by hiring the best possible talent we can get right through the organization. And obviously the drivers are no exception. So we're fortunate. We have two outstanding drivers. But really, what underpins the success is the teamwork. For every driver, there are hundreds of engineers working on thousands of components all the time throughout the year, processing billions of data points in a weekend. Non-stop. So unless this entire organization works in concert, we won't win at the race. So really the drivers are just the most visible protagonists of a highly efficient team. And it's a team that's driven by one singular objective. It's very crystal clear that McLaren is to win every single Formula One race. So that's shooting for the stars, because that's not likely to happen. But that's our mantra. We celebrate success very briefly, because that's what we're paid to do. And also, if we don't succeed and win, we move on really quickly. But we haven't got time to wait. We're in a constant battle. And for that reason, the way we organize the team and distribute the team is quite important too. For those of you who are not familiar with Formula One, it involves as much a race of technology as it does of driver performance. And that team that underpins the race is distributed. So you've got the driver at the track who has to trust that large team behind him who's pushing him to push the car to the limits. You've got the team principal on the pit wall with his management team. you've got the strategists and engineers back in Woking in England. Doesn't matter which country the race is taking place, the strategy is dictated from the UK. So imagine you're the driver, you've got to trust the strategist, who's a mathematician sitting in Woking. He's never driven a car at this speed in his life, but he's actually shaping what you should do. And the management is listening into the dialogue, but only intervening when there's a need for an escalation. So we've delegated absolutely to the point of most expertise, not to the point of highest authority, which is something you don't see in most large organizations. But you, having a small to medium-sized organization, you've got every ability to do that, and probably most of you are flat. In terms of product, well, we never have a finished product. This product is always evolving. We are, like many industries, subject to regulation. So each year the rules change, and so we all start again on the car design. Typically 80% of the car is re-engineered from one year to another. And throughout the season, we're upgrading the design all the time. So much so that if we won a race at the first race of the season and didn't change the car, we'd be right at the back of the grid by the end of the season. We typically upgrade a component. Well, last year it was every 20 minutes we were re-engineering parts on the car. And typically it's 10, 15 parts or systems are upgraded from one race to another. So it's non-stop innovation. We never stay still. We never accept that we've got something that's good enough. So given that we have an incomplete product, it's not a prototype, but it's not a finished product either, we have to spend a lot of time preparing prior to a race. For us, it's the equivalent to a campaign for you. Essentially, we're going to be publicly scrutinized, so we need to test this product to the limits of performance. And one of the keys to doing this really fast is the way we've exploited models that have been developed from data. So I'm going to jump in the deep end, and I'll almost work backwards to where we measure data to build up models to allow us to simulate for design. But this is the end goal. I think most industries are nowhere close. In motorsports and now in car design, we've proven that we can be pioneers of the use of simulation to give competitive advantage, both to design products around the human, but also to shorten the life cycle of development. But it all starts with data and measurement. So this is a cycle that I think of as innovative. You simulate to design, that's iterative. You then test out the designs in a virtual world, you test out in reality, and you close the gap between what you expected to happen to what actually happened. And then you just come back. You continuously improve your product. But right at the heart of all of this is the way you manage the data and the way you put the human in the environment to validate the models that you're developing. So currently, in the High Performance Center, which is where we do simulation, it's the result of 15 years worth of development, where we have a Formula One chassis in an environment that can simulate racing to such a degree that we now design cars in this facility. More than that, we design the cars around the driver. So the driver is able to validate that an engineering upgrade yields the performance gain that we expect in a virtual world. And he has absolute trust because he feeds into the validation of these models after the race, and I'll come on to that. So this is a way that we can use simulation, which is the output of deep mining of data, to build up models of vehicle dynamics in this case, to design a product around the individual. It's also an environment in which we can create an expert team from a team of experts by definition, because we can subject them to scenarios that they might not come across in everyday engineering or everyday racing. So we can test their judgment once we've already proven that they have the skills. So simulation as a tool for design, we were the first to do that in motorsport. I think we still are the only ones to do it to this degree. We're also doing this for car design. Lately, we've been doing it for bike design. We're next moving into boat design. I think this is a whole different approach to designing goods around the individual. So you validate with design. Some things you can't model. You have to use experiments. So that was the scale model. And what's more important, whatever you're testing, you're gathering data from each event. And what we do, we pool that information into what we call MIDAS. It's our integrated data analysis and simulation system. In common language, it's our knowledge management tool that we grew ourselves. And I think this is something I've never seen in another organization. Knowledge management, which is so pervasive and so trusted and not challenged. At McLaren, nobody hoards information. There's no differences of opinion because people have different stashes of data. There's only one single source of the truth. Everybody refers to it, everybody feeds into it, and everybody applies the models that come out of it. So it's possibly one of our most significant sources of competitive advantage. The fact that we've hoarded all the data over all of those years. We've been digital for over a decade. And we don't talk about big data, but we've been processing big data also for over a decade. And now it's probably the biggest barrier to displacement we have, because any new team doesn't have the advantage of such models. They don't have the simulation capabilities that we have, which is why we actually service almost half the teams on the grid. So far we've got a product, we've tested out the limits of performance, and we believe, based on our mining of data, that we can expect how this should play out in a race. So for us, we'll always go into a race with a strategy, which by definition is a plan to win. But we leave nothing to chance, because most people know in the military sphere, most plans don't survive first contact with the enemy. Well, the same is true for us in our sport. So we have to first measure everything that we want to manage, right? Every question we want to answer must have some data input to underpin it. So we measure what we need to know to manage the strategy. We don't collect data for the sake of it, because sensors are weight and that impedes performance. Moreover, we take that data and feed it back into mission control and Woking, and that's where we would essentially use that data to guide strategy in real time. So we don't have one strategy, we run thousands of strategies in parallel. If you like, we're asking what-if scenarios. What if the competitor makes a certain move on us? What's the best course of action? And we always work back from what the best possible outcome is under the circumstances. So what I like about this is it's a very dynamic approach to strategy. We don't stick to the plan rigidly. We don't react to events as they unfold by thinking. We're actually gathering the intelligence we want from the sensor network on the car, hundreds of streams of data coming back. We build intelligence from that data that's actionable. We feed that data into the models, which are in that database that we just described previously, and that starts giving us predictive intelligence. Because over the years, we've developed machine learning so we can suggest winning moves based on live data. Now, when you can do that in your business, you can absolutely change the game. And very few people are working in that way today. In the extreme cases, we've got models that can be prescriptive in the right course of action. Typically on tire changes, we can have a warning to the team that if such an event occurs, this is what you do. And that saves an awful lot of time and doesn't require people to be thinking too hard. It just guides them to the right decision under pressure. Because under pressure or under fierce competition, it's very hard to take the right decision. A simple one that relates to the unpredictability of our world is weather. When it rains, you've got to change the tires, but the call is quite a difficult one. I think a GCSE student could answer the question if we posed it simply, like, is it worth it? Can you lose 20 seconds and slot back into a gap in the traffic? But under pressure, you can't. So you need something that will suggest, if this happens, make the move. And then the 21 guys jump into a mechanical ballet, and if all goes right, we come out and we're slotted into the traffic. This is the sort of tool we would use, where you're looking at the gap between yourselves and the competition and how that evolves over time. You'll also extrapolate into the future to see what the best possible outcome should be if you make that move. So you see the strategy is guided dynamically, and this graph actually evolves like this throughout the race, and we're just watching how is our driver likely to come out, and we're also modeling the competition. So real-time strategy, competing for a future, all the time, real time, throughout the race. And we don't stop after the race. That's the way we run the business. We're always trying to improve, and we're predicting how much faster we can improve than the competition. So if all goes to plan, like it did last weekend, we win. We can't predict the future, which is why we don't win every race, but it's certainly strategy has underpinned some of our successes, even when we've had an inferior product, or even when we've started from an inferior position. Not all teams use this approach to strategy. And so we know the few that do, and they tend to be the ones at the front of the grid, because they've got the longevity or they've got the technology. So straight after a race, the first thing that's done is a quick debrief in the garage. And this is religious, because people believe that the data underpins success. So the drivers are almost conditioned not to be satisfied with the product. They're instructed to tell us how it could be better. So that ethos of continuous improvement, again, it permeates through the organization. There's not really much cause to celebrate if you know that your competition is trying to improve their product to overtake you. So we feed back into the machine to make sure that the product keeps getting better. And back at the factory, we do a very deep debrief the week after every race to understand all the aspects of what went right and what went wrong. It doesn't matter if it's a disastrous weekend or a successful weekend, you always do the forensic analysis of the operation. We do have a culture of brief celebration, just as we have a brief analysis when things go wrong, because you have to move on. At McLaren, we wear rocket red on the Monday. The signs all go red, but we don't sit around drinking champagne. I've seen other teams having parties, all the rest of it. McLaren is pretty much pack up, debrief, and move on. It's very, very military, and good for that. So I think it's paid off at McLaren, because why would you want to listen to McLaren and not another team? Well, since 1950, 115 teams or businesses have come and gone. Most have only survived 6 years in the business. Some have spent billions without a single trophy to show for it. Over that period, only 2 teams have prevailed. And McLaren has an unbeaten track record over the same period. It's been on the podium a half of all races raced, and it's won a quarter of all races raced over that 50-year period. So certainly something about McLaren is working. This trophy cabinet, by the way, is one you walk past as you come out of the restaurant. So every day you're reminded why you're there. And the people in the garage, they look at that trophy cabinet as they're working. So maybe a few words about how this approach could be applied beyond Formula One. And like I say, I speak from experience. I know this isn't just hyperbole. The starting point for us is, just as we injected science into the sport, I'd say the same in business. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. Certainly in other sports, you can't train for it. So sports science is just starting on this world of let's measure things. But then data becomes the problem, as we've heard this morning. So for me, mobile sensor networks and the pervasive communications network that we live in today, that opens a vast opportunity for all of us. I left telecoms because I believed machine-to-machine was the future rather than peer-to-peer communications. When your assets are tweeting, that then gives us a phenomenal opportunity to get intelligence for how products are being used, the context in which they're being used, and that would be a marketeer's dream for targeted advertising. I think when the world we live in is fully instrumented, which we're getting close. I mean, you know, cars can carry SIMs that can tell us how you're driving, where you're driving. It opens up new models for insurance, for city planning, etc. The examples are endless, but what irritates me actually is we spend so much time talking about big data when big data isn't the answer. The processing of the data isn't even the answer. It's understanding what questions we want to answer and then deriving algorithms that will provide the actionable intelligence and ultimately predictive intelligence. That's how we can compete in real terms. So in that sense, the question that I would often want to ask when people come to us for a telemetry system, if they don't know why they're asking the question or why they're gathering the data, they're already barking up the wrong tree and they're unlikely to succeed in the business. I think for business or product design, you must know what the output of a change is going to be in terms of a benefit to the user or some meaningful contribution to the end result before you start down the road. And for that, you need to start knowing what questions you need to answer, using the available sensors and communications network, and having a plan and a strategy that will build up models. So think of it as meta products or products with intelligence inside. So at the business level, I think if you applied a strategic approach that we saw in racing to develop lead indicators for strategic execution of a company, you could literally compete for the future in real time by monitoring your performance all the time, real time, by instrumenting the products as they're out in the market, and further capturing data from the instrumented world to understand how your competitors are moving relative to yourselves. Most businesses today take a rear view mirror. They look at last month's sales figures. They may do strategy once a year, and if they're at best, they're using balanced scorecards and updating them monthly. But that's a very static approach. Now, we've worked with some of the biggest companies actually in the world who are looking to set up a mission control for their company to dynamically steer strategy and campaigns, monitoring competitors plus themselves. I do think this is a new frontier for competitive advantage, and I've certainly seen some of the very largest pharmaceutical and FMCG companies moving in this direction. So, P&G to be one, and GSK would be the other. So it's not science fiction to talk about you could instrument supply chains, for example. You could optimize inventory if you could monitor your products from manufacture to point of sale right down to point of consumption. And the technology that's underpinning that is tiny sensors, imperceptibly small sensors that will be cheap enough to emit such data. We're getting there. We're not there today, but certainly that's the intent of some of these major companies. Let's go to product design and product design around the individual as a sort of some closing remarks. I believe we can use technology to optimize equipment performance relative to human performance. And I think bioenhancement will be one of our big frontiers where we see lots of startups beginning to extract the value from the data that's already out there. It's becoming quite commonplace. The geeks are already beginning to measure their own performance. What they call it, self-tracking, is beginning to catch on. That's just the start of something that's really quite significant for the health and wellness market. But once we actually can measure the basic vital signs of a human, the next challenge is how do you interpret that to understand what's important to deliver performance. Well, lots of athletes are working with us in that regard at the moment, so it's very much a nascent science. Similarly, in the health sphere, pre-symptomatic analysis of when you've got, or when you need an early warning that something is about to go off the rails, that would be a phenomenal frontier. Just as soon as those sensors are small enough and cheap enough to be worn and integral to clothing, and we're getting there. We're getting there with elite athletes, we're getting there with special forces. The price point's coming down, so it feels to me like over the next decade, we will be there with pervasive human monitoring. And I think once you've got human monitoring, let's also monitor the machine, so to speak, and optimize the two. And this is where I think if you took a bike, a simple bike, and put a brain on the thing, instrument it, put the sensors integral to the body of the bike, and then you understand how it's being ridden, how it behaves to that particular cyclist, build up the data. This is exactly what we've done. We've analyzed the bike like it was a Formula One car, build up models that allow us to shape how you design the bike, then optimize it for the person on the bike. Look, we talk about customizing genes. Well, why don't we customize products like cars and bikes to the people that buy it? It's far more valuable. And that's the best example we can cite of a, success in action. This was Mark Cavendish winning the green jersey, went on to win the World Championship on the bike that my small team designed with Specialized, and that was our first attempt at designing bikes. We knew nothing about bike design, but we knew everything about data-driven design and simulation. So there you have, this is the words of Specialized. I think it's a winning formula. It's a formula that we've applied into the F1 car. We've applied it to road cars. We design road cars using simulation. So we're already designing cars for 2015 in this environment. We've done it for bikes. We've got a slew of other applications where I think you put a human in the loop, you can really change the game in the way you'll design products. So that's my last slide. I think I'm bang on time. But really, the essence there is success needs clear objectives, total alignment, relentless pursuit of excellence, and never accepting that something is good enough, and just striving for something that's beyond what you believe is possible. And we embrace technology not for its own sake. We spend more time trying to figure out what's meaningful for our users or what's going to produce an ROI. If it's racing, it's making the car faster. If it's bikes, it's making it lighter, stiffer, more rideable. It depends on the application. But if you know what questions you're trying to answer, I think the technology is already there to gather the data that you need. So move on from big data. Let's get into intelligence. Thank you. Okay, sure.
Just going to get Geoff to wait for a second. That was Geoff, where are you? That was an absorbing, fascinating, extraordinary insight into the future. I've written down things that I never thought I would write down, like pre-symptomatic analysis. I mean, incredible journey into the future, some of which is long horizon, some of which is nearer term. Just before we let Geoff leave the stage, I just wonder immediately whether anybody has got any questions or indeed reflections on how any of that might apply within your own businesses. I mean, I was thinking of bicycles. I don't know whether Will Butler-Adams is in the audience still, okay. But the idea of, inserting the kind of brains into bicycles that you apply. But any observations or questions for Geoff before we let him go? Or has he blown you away totally?
Actually, I'm going to stay around, so if anybody wants to talk over drinks, Great. I'm staying.
Okay, good. Well, we'll take you up on that. So let's give a warm round of applause to Geoff. Thank you. Thank you very much.